Our scripture today is Luke 22, verses 24 to 30. Also a dispute arose among the disciples as to which of them was to be considered the greatest. Jesus said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you a kingdom just as my Father conferred on me, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on my thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." Will, I'm leaving this podium to you.
Thank you, Lois. Thanks to all of you for coming this morning. We are journeying, like I said during the prayer time, journeying towards the cross. And this is a more joyful Sunday. We look through the other Lent material and it can be a little bit heavy. But this morning we get to be a little bit joyful, and we invite the kids to wander through the sanctuary with their poems. And it's fun and it's cute, and we get to put ourselves into the story a little bit. But we know, if we look at the details of the story, that first procession would have felt a little bit different. And it seems to me that this year especially, that's become a little bit more aware to us. That this event, this procession, the Palm Sunday procession, is in some ways, this is a worship event, so that's why we feel like it fits here. But it's also a kind of a political rally. And I've talked about this before, how it was a kind of a triumph. In Greek and Roman societies, the leaders of the military would process into the city and would be received with celebration and praise and honor and all of those things. So this looks like that. This has the hallmarks of a political rally. But at the same time, it is also a protest. Because Jesus coming into the city is not an established, recognized, authorized political leader. And so for him to be stirring up a crowd, which is not authorized or endorsed by the political, religious, social systems of the day, this is a protest. The people gathering around Jesus are protesting the established powers. And as we are all becoming more familiar, when there is a protest in the town, you either love it or you hate it. And so for us to sit happily on the sidelines and watch a protest is inconsistent with the way that protests work now and how they would have worked in those days. So, how do we connect with this event then? Philip Yancy is an author that I enjoy reading. He has a new biography out, which I haven't gotten to, but it's on my list. But he tells a story of how in his travels, he's not just a writer, but a speaker, and is often invited to different places. And so in his travels, he was in Vienna, Austria. And while he was there, he said, well, the classical music in this city is fantastic. The arts and the culture is fantastic. I have to take in a show. So he went to one of the grand theaters, I've forgotten the details, and a group of classically trained professional world-traveling musicians was there. And they performed a long list of pieces flawlessly, beautifully eliciting emotions and everything in the crowd. And it was a highlight of his trip. Well, he came back to regular life, and it wasn't his kids, but there were some children in the community that he was a part of, his neighbors through the church, and they were having an event, a Christmas recital, something like that. And so he went, and it was a band, a grade 7 and 8 band. I remember playing in one of those bands. And just coincidentally, they performed one of the same pieces. And he said part of him, a superficial part, a snobbish part, but part of him was cringing at the disparity between the elegant performance he had seen, world-class musicians performing this beautiful piece, and now, same piece in the hands of amateurs, children, undertrained, inexperienced, hardly able to appreciate the complexity of their own instruments, let alone the beauty of the piece that they had. And as he sat there fighting with himself, fighting with these two impulses, one to celebrate that these children are doing something beautiful, and one saying, this isn't beautiful enough. And then he realized, but this is what we do. This is the church. This is us as human beings trying to show grace to one another, following the example of Jesus. So here we are, we're celebrating Palm Sunday. We're putting ourselves in a position to celebrate what Jesus did, what his followers did, but we're really kind of behind the curve on this. There's so much that we have to learn. Part of it is we weren't there. There are a lot of things we can't understand. Partly we have so many comforts and things that we take for granted in our society that we can't really get it. But when we look through the Bible story, it also seems like a lot of times the disciples didn't get it either. And the Bible scholars sort of argue, were the gospel writers exaggerating? Why would we portray these disciples as being so dim-witted when they were the ones learning from Jesus? So maybe this is a storytelling technique. Maybe they really were out to lunch. But the disciples sit down and have this conversation that Lois read for us. They're debating amongst themselves who is the greatest, who will be the most important among them. At the same time as they are approaching Jerusalem and getting ready for what Jesus has been talking about as a trial, as a difficult time. They don't seem to understand the weight of what they are going through. They don't understand the weight of the Passover meal. They have sat down with Jesus. He has broken the bread with them. They have shared the wine together. We had a communion meal a few weeks ago through the Mennonite Church Alberta shared service. There's also going to be a communion time at the joint Good Friday service, which is happening on Friday at First Mennonite Church. There's some information in the email. If you haven't seen that, or if you don't get the emails, you can come talk to me. But the disciples have had this meal. We, on the outside, we know, hey, this is our meal. This is the event that we have continued from Jesus' example. The disciples were there. The disciples have heard all of this teaching. And then they're arguing about who is going to be the greatest, whose legacy is going to last, who gets to sit at Jesus' right and left, who is going to be the most powerful among them. There are a long list of disconnects. One, they don't know what's coming, so they think Jesus is coming to install his kingdom. And partly that's because Jesus has talked like that. The kingdom is going to be initiated. He is going to be elevated, but not the way that they're thinking. So they said, hey, Jesus is going to be elevated. We're close to him. Of course, we will be elevated too. which also eventually comes true. But they don't understand that when Jesus talks about being elevated, about being lifted up, they're not talking about becoming more important. Jesus isn't talking about sitting on an actual throne. He's talking about being elevated onto the cross. And all of the disciples, as we understand it, would find their own death shortly after in a very similar way. They would all be elevated. And when they were eventually elevated, they had come to understand this. But in this moment, they are not. We often don't understand the weight of events until we get to see it through the lens of history. When you look back on your life, where were you when certain historical events happened? We may not have appreciated the magnitude of those events until later on. Some of the big ones, of course, were obvious. It's obvious when a president is assassinated. This is a benchmark moment. It's obvious when the Twin Towers in New York were hit. This is a benchmark moment in our lives. But with a little bit of passage of time, we look back and we say, "Oh, that was a big thing." Things changed after that. The disciples also didn't understand the weight of their own future. They didn't understand their present. They didn't really see where it was coming. And so Jesus is explaining to them. He sees this argument, he sees this conversation about power, and he steps in. And he makes them think, as we are going to be thinking, what does power look like? What should power look like in a community of people who follow Jesus' example? When we look around the world now, and we would ask, well, who has power? Well, that's a pretty obvious answer, but it has changed lately. And our appreciation of that power has changed. So we have political leaders that have power, but over the last few years, we have seen them stumble in new and different ways. We've seen that the people in power have had to take advice and guidance from medical professionals who, before this, we didn't think had any power. And if you're following the news closely, you see that from time to time, industry groups who are, perhaps less benevolent than the ones that Lois mentioned in the children's story, they want to advocate for industry protection. They want to advocate for their own interests. And so then they kind of tug the strings of the people in power. And how much power do the people who run our news outlets have? How much power do the people who run our social media outlets have? All of these things have been shifting and been kind of coming more to the surface as we process the events of the last few years. At different times in history, we've seen different styles of power, and we're seeing one now in Russia. Vladimir Putin has power, and there are challenges to his power and have been throughout his reign. The lead opposition politicians somehow mysteriously become ill or are imprisoned or are killed. Now, as he's launching this attack on Ukraine, there are peace protests. There are people who stand up to his power, and what happens to them? They end up in jail or disappear. And in some of our family histories, we know those stories of what happens when people in Russia stand up to the established power. And every now and then there are questions, public questions about why is power being demonstrated in this way? And the Putin response is, I'm in power. I get to make the decisions. I get to wield the power the way that I want to because I'm in power. Right? There's a self-justifying element of power. I'm in power. I get to make the decisions. Why did I make the decisions like that? Because I'm in power and I get to. This is Putin's way of showing power. And here, within a democracy, we sort of feel like we have protections against that. That if we have somebody who is wielding power the wrong way, well, that will only last maybe 5 years, because then we'll have an election. And if we together collectively decide that the power has been wielded improperly, then we elect somebody else. And we feel like we have a better protection against that. But if you've lived through a couple of election cycles, then you understand, oh, the new person is wielding power very much like the last person. And it can feel very futile. In 1968, Martin Luther King gave a speech to a group of people who were striking, some striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. And in that time, he defined power as the ability to achieve purpose and to effect change. So this is a good definition of power, because we know, and at least we hope, that power can be good. Power can be wielded for good changes. Power doesn't have to be bad by definition. Many of us have gotten ourselves behind certain politicians thinking that this one will be different, this power will be good. And we've also been disillusioned by powers on the other side. I've been to a few protests in my day, and I've seen both sides of those movements. A long time ago, when Canada was deciding whether or not to join the Iraq War, there were a number of us who were concerned about that, and so I attended a peace rally. And there were thousands of us, tens of thousands. I wouldn't be surprised if there were 100,000 people marching through Toronto that day. Well, what happened? Well, we marched, and we chanted, and we sang, and then we went home. And we watched the news that night to see what had happened. Well, on the news, there was a story of a skirmish with some protesters and the police. On the news, there was an estimate that there might have been 20,000 people there. I saw 20,000 people with my own eyes, and I didn't see the skirmish that they had talked about. So somebody was underestimating. Somebody was focusing on different things. This is the nature of protest. This is the nature of how the media responds to protests. And then we, the consuming public, we decide, is this a legitimate protest, or is this something that we don't care about? If we are invested, then the media responds to that investment, and then the cycle goes around again. Another time I was at a Promise Keepers rally. For those of you who don't remember, Promise Keepers was a men's group calling Christian men to be better husbands, better fathers, more upstanding members of society. And so I went to this event also back in Ontario, and there were speeches, there were rallies, there was some worship time, and I didn't understand it much then. I understand it a little bit better now, but there was a protest outside of our men's gathering. There were people protesting that the ways that Promise Keepers was encouraging men to be better men was in fact oppressive to women. Now, I get the argument better now than I did then, but it was interesting. As we were going into the building, there was a woman standing there with a bucket, and she said she was from a women's shelter. And there were these protesters in view of us, and so from time to time there would be a man who would sort of defiantly throw money into her bucket to shut up the protesters. I think they had some sort of deal worked out, because it sure worked. A whole bunch of men were giving money to kind of show the protesters that we were in fact good, upstanding men. We had a lunch break at this Promise Keepers event, and the protest became an information picket, is what the words they used. And so we were outside. It was a summer day. We were eating our lunches outside, and these picketers came through distributing leaflets and pamphlets and whatnot. And a few of them stopped to talk to me, and I said, you guys need to understand, and I knew from the men that I was with, most of these men are here because their wives told them to come. It's a Saturday. They would much rather be home mowing the lawn or watching sports or working on their trucks in their garage. They would much rather be doing that than coming here. It was a good conversation back and forth. There were less good conversations among some of the other picketers. But those are difficult spaces to be in. When there's a group of people who have firm convictions on one side, another group of people who have firm convictions on the other side, how do those groups interact? And so we've seen some of that across the country. In Ottawa, it's made a lot of news. But even here in Calgary, we've established a tradition in my family. I've established a tradition that on Palm Sunday, I find a park where there's a statue of a man sitting on a horse. Because those are always defiant statues, symbols of victory and power. Last year we found there's a statue of Robert the Bruce, an early Scottish king, on the campus of SAIT. There were a few others. There's one that I mentioned last year too, excuse me, of Colonel MacLeod. But the one that I like, that I visited the most often, is at Central Memorial Park. There's a statue there of a soldier sitting on a horse. It's a defiant symbol, but the story behind it is much more tragic. There was a World War I veteran who came back to Calgary. His mind wasn't quite right. He didn't have the family supports that he needed. He couldn't get work because he was bringing home PTSD and other things from the war. And one morning his body was found in a ditch. He had drunk himself to death. And the community felt so convicted by this that they erected a statue in his memory. Not just him, but all of the people who had come home in similar situations. But his death sort of inspired this. So here's this statue with a dark story behind it, but a hopeful presentation. Hopefully we can earn what our deceased soldiers have fought for. In the same park, there's an eternal flame of memory for other soldiers. It is a memorial park. It's in a nice neighborhood. There's a playground nearby. There's a nice bookstore nearby. There's a couple of churches right there. Not as many restaurants as I would like, but it's a nice neighborhood. But lately, that has been the site of anti-vaccine protests. So the process of how we got to this point involves a whole lot of power, a whole lot of people in power making decisions. So the health authorities of this country have made decisions based on their research, and they said we should behave in a certain way. People in power in the government looked at the research, looked at the power given to these health people, and they responded accordingly, imposed restrictions on society. And after those restrictions were made, a federal election took place, and the same party was reinstated. But that validation of power wasn't enough, and so the protesters established themselves at this park that this is what Saturday is going to look like at Central Memorial Park until sufficient changes are made. I haven't talked to the leaders, I haven't gotten their side of it exactly, but this is sort of the way that it's been presented. Well, this group has, from the beginning, it had grown, and they were behaving in a similar way that the protesters in Ottawa were behaving. Well, they were protesting on a regular basis, and of course, whenever there's a large crowd, the police come to make sure that there's some semblance of order. Well, the protest lasted long enough, it was loud enough and persistent enough and disruptive enough that there developed a counter-protest. And so there was a regular protest, and on the opposite side was a counter-protest, people protesting the protesters. And there's this, at that site, there's this crazy amalgamation of power. Who's in charge? Whose ways is going to win out? And as this was building up, the protest was still strong. The counter-protest was growing. And of course, then the police presence was growing. And there was a march, and it came to a head when the protesters weren't backing down, and the counter-protesters weren't backing down, and the police stepped in to establish order. So who's going to win? Whose order is going to be established? Whose power is going to reign supreme? Well, some of you have been following the news, but otherwise you could probably predict what was going to happen. Are they going to invite the leaders and sit down at a roundtable conversation and hear the pros and cons? No. Are they going to gather the voices in and then flip a coin and decide randomly who gets to go through? No, they're not going to do things that way. This is a question of power. And the counter-protests were for a long time arguing that the police have an obligation to step in and establish order, which they had failed to do. So many of the counter-protesters were saying, you're not using your power correctly, so we are here because you have failed. And the protesters were saying, hey, we're with you, police, but the situation is messed, so we're here even though you don't want us to be here. We're going to disrupt traffic even though you tell us not to. We're going to make noise even though you tell us not to. For us, the highest priority is personal freedom, and in the pursuit of that, we're going to kind of set aside some of these other rules. So we understand in that situation that there is power. There is power in numbers. When a whole bunch of people show up, you can arrest a few people, but unless you've got busloads of space for people you arrest, there is power in numbers that even the police can't stop. Well, after this kind of reached a boiling point, the city government stepped in and issued some edicts. And the provincial government has spoken about it. The police force has spoken about it. Power. Everybody with power has a say in what is happening here. Now, we can look at this story and we can take sides. We can take sides with the expression of freedom. We can take sides with the people who live in that neighborhood and have to put up with the protest. We can take sides with the police who only want order. We can take sides in various places. This probably won't be the last protest, so it doesn't really matter where you pick sides. There are questions that I think resonate with what Jesus is asking his disciples. How is it that we demonstrate power when we are committed to public service, when we're committed to serving other people, when we're committed to laying down our lives? So the weight of this conversation would have changed after Jesus' death, too. So, Jesus explains that, so I just want to get the wording right here. It says, the kings of the Gentiles rule over their subjects, lord it over their subjects, as many of our translations say. If you want to follow the Gentile model of leadership, then yeah, we put somebody in place who rules over everybody. Now, it's unclear exactly what Jesus meant by Gentiles, because everybody else was Gentile. There are various forms of leadership, but the Jewish kings also lorded over everybody. But if we go back to the installation of King Saul back in the Old Testament, then we see that's kind of what happened. That the people of Israel said, hey, we want a king like everybody else. We want a king like the Gentiles. And the priest said, hey, we can do that, but if you do, they will lord it over you. They will take your best crops, they will take all of your money, they will take from your children and send them to war, if that's what you want. And the people said, yes, that's what we want. So, Jesus says, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them. And he says, and those in authority, so this is, the Common English translate this a little bit differently. But it says, and those in authority over them are called friends of the people, or benefactors was the word that Lois read. So we sort of see this here in our lives every now and then too. We have people who take positions of power, they rule it over everybody, and they still claim to be friends of the people. Right, well, it's no friend of mine, but that's what they call themselves. And then Jesus says, but that's not the way it will be with you. Some of you grew up in churches where the person at the front would say, peace be with you, and everybody would respond with, and also with you. As I was reading through this passage today, I sort of thought, maybe every now and then, Mennonite pastors, when they're raging against the evils of the world, they should say something like this: that's not the way it will be with you. And then the congregation could respond, neither with you. I feel like that would be a way of kind of putting ourselves into the story a little bit more. But Jesus is kind of painting this picture of power. This is what power looks like out there, but in here it will be different. And then so he gives them a meal metaphor. Think of a meal. Everybody's sitting down together. Who's more important, the person eating or the person serving? And they had just eaten a meal together. But who had served the meal? Jesus had served the meal. So if you want to follow Jesus, if you want to follow me, Jesus is saying, it's going to be different. If you want to follow my example of leadership, then here it is. I'm wandering around to the outside. I'm making sure that everybody has what they need. Some of you may have been following the story that I mentioned. There was a clash between the protesters and the counter-protesters with the police in the middle. And what did the police do? Well, they recognized, in order to minimize the possibility of conflict, in order to minimize the danger to individuals, they violently pushed the counter-protesters out of the way, because there were fewer of them. The police showed power, recognizing the power of the group. The police have power given to them by the state, and they only know how to use that power violently. Most of the time, we don't put up a fuss, and they don't get violent with us. Every now and then, people push them to that limit. Every now and then, they bring themselves to that point. But that's the kind of power they are given. But Jesus says, it will not be like that with you. Jesus' followers saw his example. They saw the way that he would serve. They saw the way that he would give food. They saw the ways that he would heal. But they weren't looking for an example of leadership. They saw Jesus, as I talked about a few weeks ago, from a human point of view, from a physical point of view. They said, hey, this is a guy who feeds me when I need it. I want to be close to him. This is a guy who heals people magically, so he has special power. I want to follow him and benefit from his power. And yeah, Jesus was interested in feeding people. He was interested in healing people. But he also wanted the people closest to him to follow his example. We see oftentimes around the world there are revolutions, violent revolutions to overthrow a greedy, violent, oppressive system. And the world celebrates at the removal of another dictator, but then we watch cautiously as the replacement decides what kind of power they are going to wield. And so a lot of people are hoping for, sort of predicting the violent downfall of Putin. That may happen, it may not. But they won't replace him with a kind, gentle leader. That's not how politics works. If we take power the way that the world has power, then we are tempted to show that same power. But Jesus says it is not to be that way with you. If we look at the protest, counter-protest example that I mentioned, what guidelines are they following? Well, the government's making decisions. They are guided by founding documents of this country, but they're also guided by a desire to stay in power. They want to make decisions so it looks like they're making decisions so that when it comes time to re-elect them, then they can say, we made decisions. What are the police guided by? Well, the police have protocols that they have to follow. The police have outcomes that they're desiring. But they're also given systems that they can do that. They're given weapons, they're given training, and that's what they're guided by. What are the protesters guided by? They're guided by personal freedom. That's their central reason for gathering. Those are also the guidelines of how they show power. Counter-protesters, well, they're saying this is our neighborhood. We want peace in our neighborhood. Then they're guided by that. What are we guided by? In our families, in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, we are guided by Jesus. So if we want power, if we expect power, then this is our model. Jesus says, if you want power, you've got to do it like me. If you want to lead, you have to serve. If you want to show people the way to go, you have to guide them from below. There are a lot of ways to show power over people, to push people down. But Jesus' model was different. To lift people up and to help people to see the power that they have. So as we journey towards the cross, as we reflect on the power that we have, as we reflect on the ways that we show power and expect power, may we follow Jesus' power. Follow the one who washed his followers' feet. Follow the one who served food and healed people and welcomed people. That was the way that Jesus showed power. That is the way that power is demonstrated in the kingdom. And to do that, we have to distance ourselves from the way that power happens here. So may we do that courageously and lovingly and live into a different kind of kingdom than the world around us knows.